I'm Senator Joe Lieberman, and I'm glad you're watching Rabbi Doug.
We're gonna see Rabbi Doug. We're gonna see Rabbi Doug. We're gonna see Rabbi Doug on your TV tonight. But Daddy, I want to watch Monday Night Football.
Forget about Monday Night Football. There's no other thing we're going to watch on Monday but Rabbi Doug.
Yeah, Rabbi Doug on TV tonight. We're going to see Rabbi Doug. Oh, everybody talk about it.
Shalom and welcome to Taped with Rabbi Doug. We are here in Chicago, Illinois. And again, we have lost some great scholars during this period of COVID. First of all, I'd like to mention Rabbi Dr. Abraham J. Twersky, who was born in Milwaukee and was one of the most famous Hasidic doctors in the world as a rabbi and a psychiatrist. He not only put a connection between Torah and the 12-step program for Alcoholics Anonymous, but he also treated so many people. He was the director of psychiatry at St. Francis Hospital in Pittsburgh, and the Gateway Rehabilitation Center, which he founded, was named one of the top 12 rehabilitation clinics in the United States by Forbes magazine in 1987. He wrote over 80 books and on many, many Jewish topics, including addiction, personality, and so many other things. He was on our show a number of years ago, and I just want to mention him today of blessed memory, Rabbi Dr. Abraham J. Twersky. Also today, we are going to share some words from another former guest on my TV show, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, who is globally renowned as a great scholar and teacher as the Chief Rabbi of the United Kingdom from 1991 to 2013. Rabbi Sacks gained fame both in the secular world and in Jewish circles. He was sought after on issues of war and peace, religious fundamentalism, ethics, and the relationship between science and religion, among other topics. Rav Sacks wrote more than 20 books. It is nearly impossible to overstate the importance of Rabbi Sacks, says Laurie Zolith of the who's the Burton Professor of Religion and Ethics at the University of Chicago Divinity School. His books were a model of thoughtful, rational, deeply intellectual reflections on the importance, complexity, and power of a life as a religious Jew in a broader sense and as a person of faith. He was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II in 2005, and he was awarded a life peerage 4 years later in the House of Lords. At the same time, Rabbi Sacks was deeply rooted in the Hebrew Scriptures. A rabbi in the modern Orthodox tradition, Rabbi Sacks' commentaries on Jewish prayer books and biblical books were widely read and praised. Rabbi Sacks' passing at age of 72 from cancer was brought to the attention of the world, and there was an outpouring of tributes from the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, Prince Charles, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, among other world leaders and rabbinic scholars around the world. A number of years ago, Rabbi Sacks was a guest on our show with me in Washington, D.C. when we covered the APAC conference, and he was with me, and we want to share that with you now. So stay with us here as we remember Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former Chief Rabbi of the United Kingdom, on Taped with Rabbi Doug.
Let me just begin with a little story. Again, something that happened. For 2 years, and I say this because it actually was leaked through WikiLeaks, but for 2 years I was involved privately and secretly in a dialogue with an Iranian cleric based in London. The reason I did this, and I don't normally do this, is that his brother was the head of the Revolutionary Guard in Iran. So it was clear that this particular dialogue was taking place with the knowledge of the Iranian government And clearly they were sending out feelers. And so for 2 years, we spoke. We met every month or two, and we had the most wonderful understanding. And after 2 years, we happened to be present together at a social occasion, and he turned to me with a throwaway line. He said, you know, why do you Jews need a country? You're not a nation, you're a religion. And I thought to myself, Rabbana Shalom, have we really failed to explain to the world what Israel really is? Have we failed to explain to ourselves what Israel really is? Even in a beautiful community like Chicago, keeping Shabbos is something you do at home and in shul. It's not out there in the public domain. In Yerushalayim, you wake up and you know Shabbos is out there. It's not just in your head. You do tzedakah in Chicago or in London. It's beautiful. But you do it in Israel. It's part of the whole system of social justice, of making sure that nobody within your society is destitute or is lacking the means of a dignified life. You send your kids to a Jewish school, that's beautiful. But in Israel, education is the fundamental value of society. Israel has only one natural resource, the gifts of the individuals who make it up. And that is how Israel can do miracles, because Jews care about education more than we've ever cared about anything else. And what about the Chagim? I don't know what it's like celebrating Sukkot in Chicago. Is it anything like England? How do you keep the schach on? Explain this to me. You know, you're sitting in England celebrating Sukkot and the rain is coming down and you're freezing stiff and you're saying to yourself, this is Zman Simchaseinu? Go figure. You know, none of the Chagim makes sense except in Israel. And the truth is, when you do a mitzvah in Israel, you're doing so in the landscape of our ancestors. You're sitting there in Yerushalayim and you know exactly what David HaMelech meant when he said, I lift my eyes to the hills. You see the same hills that he saw. You are speaking the language of the Bible. You are living in the biorhythms of the Jewish calendar. In Israel, Judaism is at home. Everywhere else, it's against the grain. And that, to me, is what Judaism should be about. I don't use the phrase modern orthodoxy. I use the phrase a Judaism that engages with the world. That's what it's about. And in Chutz La'aretz, outside of Israel, we engage with the world as individuals. But in Israel, we do so as a total people. And that's where it counts. And that used to be the vision. It used to be the vision of Bnei Akiva. Harav Avodah, go out to Israel and be religious and work on a kibbutz and work the land. It used to be the vision of Isaac Breuer, you know, of the family of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who coined the phrase Torah in Derech Eretz Yisrael. You know, that it was in Israel that the Hirschian vision would come true. Ultimately, it was the vision of Rav Avram HaKohen Kook. Rav Avram HaKohen Kook uses the phrase that in Israel, mitzvot are like the tzitzit on the beged, on the garment of tarbut klalit, of the general culture. Mitzvot give sanctity to everything that takes place in Israel. But everything that takes place in Israel is so much wider in the narrow ambit of what we would call, in inverted commas, religious. That world today, whether a Bnei Akiva or Rav Kook or Rav Hirsch, is a little bit, sad to say, in eclipse in Israel today. And today there's real polarization between the world of the Charedim and the world of the Chilonim, and very, very few people in between. There's some wonderful people in between. And I don't need to name them, you all know them. But who is connecting the two? It's so sad. You know, the mashal, the analogy I give, you know, we have more Jews learning in yeshiva in Israel today than ever before in history. And we have more Jews learning in university than ever before in history, but the connection between them is less than ever before in history. And I use the analogy of that rare form of cerebral lesion, where the right hemisphere of the brain and the left are both intact, but the connection between them is broken. And the result is a dysfunction of personality. And the Jewish people today is suffering that cerebral lesion. And it shouldn't be. Because I tell you that there is so much spiritual beauty out there in Israel. And somehow, all it needs is somebody to bring it to the surface. Let me give you the most simple examples. There's a very, very spiritual and holy Jew in Israel called Reuven Feuerstein. Are you familiar with the name? Reuven Feuerstein, who must be now Kanena Arani, well into his 90s, is a man who made Aliyah in 1945 from Romania and worked with orphans of the Holocaust, child survivors, and became the world's greatest expert on traumatized and severely brain damaged children. This man, he sent children from all over the world. He's become an inspiration to inner city black schools in America because they realized that some of his methods would work for their own kids who are not reaching their full potential. This is a person who has taken the Jewish principle that every life is like a universe and applied it in ways that are just beautiful. We were just in a medical school in Safat, just opened up a department of Bar-Ilan University that's opened a branch of its medical school in Safat. And there you will find religious doctors using medicine to shape and beautify community relations, not just for the Jews in the Galil, but for the Druze and the Muslims and all the, because how do you establish common ground between different faiths and different cultures? Health is the most common of all common grounds. And when you go out there and you're helping people and you're restoring people to health, they're using that just to build ben adam l'chavero, between people and between communities, good relations. There is a wonderful charity, and I could mention so many, called Gateway in Israel. Are you familiar with the work of Gateway? It's taken this biblical mitzvah of the sheaf, the dropped sheaf, and it's turned it into the mitzvah of taking all the, I'm sure that never happens here, right? Or any food that's left over, you don't leave any over, right? But any food in Israel that gets left over from restaurants, from hotels, and every night they're gathering it up and taking it to the people who don't have enough to eat. And there's a biblical mitzvah turned into the 21st century in the most beautiful way. That is what Israel should be about. It's about taking Torah and letting it transform a total society. You know, the most Zionist thing I ever heard came from a person who was never particularly known as a Zionist. That was the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The Lubavitcher Rebbe once said a word, it was also said by the Gateway Rebbe, that I find just dazzling. He asked about the Meraglim, about the spies. When they came back and they said, we can't do it, they're giants, we're grasshoppers. And the Rebbes, both the Gateway and the Lubavitcher, asked, how was this possible? The spies were not ordinary people. They were Kulam Anashim, Rashi B'nai Yisrael. They were leaders. They were men of stature. And the Rebbe answered, you think they had fear of physical danger? Forget it. They knew that God was with them. They weren't afraid. What they were afraid of was spiritual danger. They said to themselves, look at us now. Here we are in the midbar, in the desert. We get water from a rock. We get manna from heaven. We are surrounded by ananei kavod, the clouds of glory. Never before have people lived so close to God. If we go into the land of Israel and we have an economy to run and harvest to bring in and battles to fight, what will happen to our spirituality? That was what they were afraid of. It was the sin of very, very holy people. But it was still a sin. God does not want us to disengage from society, to expect our water to be supplied from a rock and our manna from heaven, and never engage with the real world. That was a holy sin, but it was still a failure of religious nerve. And that is where we need the modern or the Judaism that engages with the world. I have to tell you that secular Israelis are not secular at all, at least not the ones I know. I tell you, you know something, I think rabbis sometimes give secular Israelis in Israel a hard time. I try not to go to Israel as a rabbi if I can possibly avoid it. Every year I take a choir, 3 chazanim, we go and make concerts for victims of terror, for people in hospitals, and we're going almost entirely among secular Israelis. And I always say when I get back, you know, these people have more emunah, more faith than any of my guys in Britain. Why? Because they ask something with me in Israel that they never ask of me in England. You know what they want from me in Israel? A bracha. That's what they want. Go tell me that these are secular people. They have neshamas, every one of them, so pure and so holy, but nobody ever showed it to them. Nobody ever showed them how beautiful they were. And I honestly believe that that is the great task of our time. But if you were to ask me, where do I see the holiness of Israel today? I see it in the treatment of children. I don't know of a more child-centered society in the world. I don't know of a better place in the world to bring up a child. When I go to Israeli schools, you know, we visited them, so many of them this last week or two, with children at risk, or up in right by the Lebanese border, bringing religious and secular kids together and seeing those secular kids in their jeans and their t-shirts all davening mincha, like, it was so beautiful. Or seeing kids from broken homes or dysfunctional homes, or the Ethiopian kids, and taking them through to being positions of distinction in Israeli society. And I think to myself, that is beautiful. That is Kedusha. After all, do you know why Abraham was chosen? We know why Noah was chosen. We know there's only one place in the whole Torah which says why Abraham was chosen. Because he will bring up his children to follow the way of the Lord, to do righteousness. And he was chosen just as a father. He was chosen not for his own sake, but because he would bring up children. To be a Jew is a parent. You know, it's like, I love that statement of the American Jewish mother who said, you know, now I become a parent, now I become a mother, I can relate to Hashem much better. Now I know what it's like to create something you can't control. I just share with you one little thought for Pesach, which to me is incredibly powerful. Tell me, who gave Moshe Rabbeinu his name?
That's powerful.
Pharaoh's daughter, right? And she called him Moshe. Because I drew him from the water. And you know, when we're kids, we read this and we take it as, you know, for granted. That's it. And it doesn't dawn on us until we've grown up a little bit. Hey, how come Pharaoh's daughter was speaking Hebrew? Are you with me? And even if she could speak Hebrew, is she going to adopt in defiance of her father's decree? You know, she knew it was a Jewish child, and Pharaoh had said every male Jewish child drown. Is she going to advertise the fact that he's Jewish by giving him a Hebrew name? So we stop and we think, hang on, there's more to this than meets the eye. And then we do our little historical investigation and we discover that Mos or Moses is actually an Egyptian word. And what does it mean? It means child, Thutmose, and so on and so forth. It appears in the name of many of the pharaohs. But the most famous pharaoh of all, the one many historians take as the pharaoh of the Exodus, has the word Moses in his name. He was Ramses II, the most famous of all the pharaohs. So, on the one hand you have Ramses, and on the other hand you have Ramses. And what's the difference? 2 letters. Ramses has R-A, Ra. And who was Ra? The sun god of the Egyptians. And now you understand the drama that we never saw before. Because Ramses is the child of the sun god, the God in human form, the person who had himself worshipped as a god in the elaborate and monumental statues he erected in his temple in Abu Simbel. He is the demigod, he is the child of the gods. And against him, what is there? Just Messiah, just a child. And God is showing in this encounter that every child, any child, is holy. It's not one child who is the child of God, but every child. Moses, the anonymous child, is holier than the Pharaoh who thinks he is a god. And it is that value of every single child that made Judaism what it was, made the old world's oldest faith still young, because we are as old as the things we care about, and because we care about our children, we stay young. And that is the holiness of Israel, a place that cares for children. Friends, I therefore say this to you, that the great challenge that we have as religious Jews in Chutz La'aretz is to share our kind of Judaism with Israel, which needs our example to connect the two halves of the hemisphere and to bring out some of the holiness that's really there, if only we could show it. But I want us to take one further message. I can't tell you how important it is to talk about all the things we're talking about in this, as so many other conferences, about politics, about defense, about diplomacy, about military tactics, strategic assessments, scenario analyses. But let us not forget one word in all of this, the word Kedusha. We are a holy people. Israel is a holy land. We were supposed to be Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, a holy nation, a kingdom of priests. And I have to tell you, I miss that sometimes in these conferences. And shall I tell you something? It makes a difference. And let me pull rank on you here and tell you how it makes a difference. Why was it that we had a wonderful Prime Minister called Tony Blair, who cared so passionately about Israel? I will tell you, because Tony Blair is a religious Christian, a deeply religious Christian, who read and reads the Bible every single night. He actually reads Tanakh most nights. He once said to me, "How come your book is so much more interesting than our book?" I said, "Prime Minister, it's because our book has more politics than your book." Prince Charles asked whether he could come to shul one evening. I will never forget that occasion. He asked, we didn't ask him. You know what occasion that was? It was Yom HaAtzmaut, for the 50th anniversary of the State of Israel. He asked to come. Why? Because he is a very spiritual man. And he understands. He came to Israel for the Levaya, for the funeral of the late Yitzchak Rabin Zal. I flew back with him, and we became friends. But he understood that Israel is a holy land, so he must go to a holy place, the synagogue, to celebrate Israel on the 50th anniversary. Don't think the concept of Kedusha matters only to us. It matters deeply to our friends among Christians and among Muslims and among Sikhs and among Hindus and among so many others. They know, sometimes even better than we do, what Israel is all about. The place God wanted us to construct a society that will be a role model for others, a society of justice and compassion, where you could feel the Shekhinah. So friends, modern Orthodoxy needs Israel. Israel needs modern Orthodoxy. Let us bring the Kedusha back into our understanding of Israel. and we will see great beauty there, and we will share that beauty with our friends. Thank you very much.
Fortunate that Rabbi Sacks will grace us for a few minutes for questions.
Could you tell us the origin of the Chief Rabbinate of Great Britain, and tell us how that came about, because we don't have such a thing in the United States, and how did it develop and come about?
The Chief Rabbinate happened in Europe very simply because in Europe Jews were, don't forget, there was an established church in every European country. I mean, and Jews existed in Europe as a religious community, not as an ethnic one. And therefore, they were constituted as a religious community, and it was the religious head of the community with whom the government liaised when it needed to liaise with the Jewish community. So it was a kind of, lahavdil elef havdalot, a kind of role like the role of Nasi under Roman rule. Are you with me? There was a kind of representative role, and that's how it grew up in Britain, because in Britain there's an Archbishop of Canterbury, so you have to have a chief rabbi. Now in America you have no Archbishop of Canterbury, so you don't need a chief rabbi. Now an attempt was made in, incidentally, that is why there are two chief rabbis in Israel. You ever wonder why there are two chief rabbis in Israel? Because under the Ottoman Empire, they needed their religious head, their Rais al-Yehud, their Rishon LeZion. And Rav Amar, the Rishon LeZion, if you will see any ex-Sephardi chief rabbi, Rav Ovadia and so on, you will see they are wearing a turban and a very brocaded robe. And you think, that's what rabbis wore. No, that is the uniform of an official of the Ottoman Empire. And that is why the Rishon LeZion is as he is now. When the British became the mandatory power in 1917, they said, where's the chief rabbi then? And they said, who? So they said, well, we have one in Britain, they'll have to have one in Israel. So it was the English chief rabbi which was unfortunately responsible for there being a second chief rabbi in Israel. So that is why there are two chief rabbis in Israel. In America, where there is no centralized religious authority, there's no Archbishop of Canterbury, there was no analog. Now in 1909, New York appointed a chief rabbi. I don't know if you know this, and he was Litvak. And within a month, the Galicianos said, well, if the Litvaks have a chief rabbi, we should have a chief rabbi. So they appointed a second chief rabbi, and then there was a third chief rabbi, Rabbi Chaim Vidrovich, on whose office door said Chief Rabbi of America, and somebody asked him who gave him the title, and he said, the signwriter. So within 3 months, New York had 3 chief rabbis, at which point they gave up and never tried again.
Well, that's it as we memorialize Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former Chief Rabbi of the United Kingdom. I want to thank you for being with us. Remember, you can check out our website, www.tvrabbi.com, where you can also see former shows on the web. If you want to email us, the email address is info@tvrabbi.com. Hope to see you next time, right here on Taped with Rabbi Doug. Shalom, everyone.
This has been a Taped with Rabbi Doug production.